Okay, so welcome to another episode of what is quickly escalating into sort of a podcast series on the epidemiology of mental health. And I started these conversations last time with Eco Fried because I kind of miss sort of the discourse we had on social media like 5 to 8 years ago about psychological sciences, but also because I think some of the most interesting science conversations happen sort of like offline at the water cooler, at a conference, at a poster session. And I think even though we've been able to like get some of the stuff we do at conference online, we haven't been able to recapture that sort of conversation. And today I'm talking to a scientist I actually know through social media or know of through social media, Amir Sariaslan, and he's a senior research fellow at the Department of Psychiatry, University of Oxford. There's like some other stuff on him, but I like first like to ask you, Amir, like you do work on psychiatry, epidemiology, criminology. What are you? What are you? Are you a criminologist, a psychological scientist? Who are you?
That's a good question. I ask myself that once in a while. So I did my PhD training in psychiatric epidemiology, so I usually call myself a psychiatric epidemiologist. My background is actually in sociology and criminology. Um, and yeah, so sometimes people call me a criminologist in the media primarily because I talk a lot about violent crime and the causes of that and the consequences of that. But more recently, they just call me a psychiatric epidemiologist.
Right, because when you study violent crime, it's very often in relationship to victimization or perpetration in relation to psychopathology, right? Or people who have a diagnosis with a psychopathology.
Yes, that has been one major research interest of mine to look at the overlap of violence and psychiatric disorders. But in the media, I have primarily been talking about the effects of socioeconomic status on violence and the causal link in them, and that's why people usually consider that to be a criminological research question.
Right,
That's why
right.
they think of me as a criminologist.
Well, all these boundaries are fluid anyway, right? Where does one field start and the other end? And so
Exactly.
one aspect of your sort of like work, I'd say that interests me in particular is that you go well beyond observational research, and I don't necessarily think you refer to your own research as causal inference very often or causal, but I think you squarely fit in that box between where you're like, well, there's an observational study that will have its limitations. Like, and I'm not against observational studies; they're great. Like one of the earliest successes in epidemiology, like finding the source of a cholera infection in London, right? John Snow, sort of the epic, original uh, tale of epidemiological studies was fully observational. But your work tries to go beyond simply observational, right? That's sort of like a theme you have.
Yes, I mean, I don't have anything against pure observational studies either, but I usually view them as being quite descriptive. The problem is often, I think, that people take these descriptive patterns and then they try to make um, causal claims based on them, try to make something out of it that it hasn't really analyzed properly. So I think that it is important to use different types of methods to try to get closer to the truth or the causal mechanisms. Although we're probably going to be discussing it throughout this episode, but it's not that easy. So triangulation is key.
Yeah, yeah. It really isn't that easy, and I think to add to what you were saying, like even if authors are careful and they purely present their work as descriptive, right? There's always a reader, right? To every author, there's also a number of readers. Sometimes it's a few readers, sometimes it's a lot of readers if it gets picked up by mainstream press, right? So even in the best of intended cases, observational studies have a risk in the sense that they can be taken out of context or their results can be misinterpreted by the reader who may not be aware of like the subtle differences between good, better, best kind of statistical designs. And one study that sort of is interesting in that respect is like some of your work on the link between epidurals during labor or during childbirth and autism in the children. So the mother takes an epidural anesthetic during labor, which is a very effective way of managing pain during labor. It has side effects, as does any drug. I'm not a doctor. I don't think you're a doctor yourself.
No,
Right, so I don't think we're going to speculate about sort of like the pros and cons of the medication itself, right? That's not necessarily our role, but there was this paper, and I don't want to necessarily blame the individual authors because this is more of a science-wide issue, right? But they basically found perfectly fine an existing correlation between the use of epidurals and then the child developing autism later. And it's a big study, 150,000 individuals, so, but it's correlational.
yeah,
And I read those things and I just go like, well, that's likely confounded. Well, what can I do? I just feel powerless and I move on with my life. I get annoyed. Maybe I get like a little active, like, what could I do? And then I think, I can't. There's nothing I can do to like show that this is just probably not real. But you didn't. You read that paper at some point, I suppose, or a colleague read a paper. How did you come across the finding, basically?
yeah. So the first author of our paper, Torane Hedvig, was a Norwegian. I believe that he's currently working as a gynecologist, but he previously been working with Henrik Larsson at the Karolinska Institute, doing some perinatal and psychiatric epidemiology. So he reached out to a number of our colleagues when this first paper was published, and he was quite concerned about the implications of it and whether it would change clinical practice, whether it would lead to women being more anxious about their decision making in terms of pain management and so on. So he really wanted to address this using a design that really accounted for unmeasured confounding. It should also be mentioned that in the first study did not even account for maternal paternal autism at all. So it wasn't even a measured confounding. So so it was really important for us to dig into it. The problem he had was that he had access to Norwegian data, and even though the original sample size was in the several hundreds of thousands of singletons, when you do a signal comparison model, you're looking into the effective sample is really the siblings that are differentially exposed to the exposure of interest, which in this case was the labor, epidural, analgesia, and then we'll have different outcomes. So your effective sample size is much smaller. So he reached out, and our Swedish colleagues were interested. They had their national language registry data, and I was also part of that. And I said, hey, I have also access to Finnish data, different years, obviously. So what happened next was that we planned on a study where we would harmonize and all of the data to the best of our abilities, have a communal pipeline, and then with actually inspiration from psychiatric genetics, with the pooled estimates from fixed effects meta-analysis models. The we just pull them using these models.
But let's slow down a bit because you're skipping over things that are very sort of obvious to you and me, but that are maybe important to discuss. So the first where I'm really interested by the first author, sort of Tor Hegvig's sort of thing, is that like this is just like any observational study, but he's rightfully, I think, concerned because like this an epidural is like a very frequent common intervention that can be very beneficial.
Yeah.
And sort of it's also a time in people's life when they're worried about all kinds of side effects, right? Because like their new baby is sort of involved, right? So where maybe some people do an observational study thinking like, well, it's just an observational study, people will sort of like understand that they shouldn't read too much into it. There's obviously this risk, and I don't want to equate the two, but there's a very other famous example of people taking a beneficial health intervention and linking it to autism. And that's like the very famous sort of like, that's a different case because that study was fraudulent, right? But like there was the link between vaccines and autism, right? And I could see how someone working in this field would be very worried if this would take off in social media, online, or for any reason. So it's a good thing you and others, by the way, there were other papers between this paper and your paper, and as you said, they were smaller. And so importantly, you said like they didn't control for confounding, and they could have maybe, but you and I both know an autism diagnosis is a fairly rare outcome. Fairly rare. It's not very rare, but it's sort of like a couple of percent of people. And so even if you were to have controlled for parents having autism, that wouldn't be sufficient, right? Because some people may have problems very like autism or almost to a point where they would have a diagnosis but not be diagnosed because they just simply haven't found care or they haven't encountered problems in their lives where they would realize like, wait, this is a thing I could get care for or need care for. And so basically what you skipped over, but your study does, or the study you collectively did, right, is take siblings where they have the same mother, obviously they're siblings. One is born after a birth where there is an epidural, and the other one is born after a birth where there's no epidural. Right? That's sort of the statistical design.
Well, not just the mother; they have the same father as well. So all of the studies that were published prior to ours, they did the so-called within-mother design, where you would have siblings, all maternal siblings, so all full biological siblings, but also maternal half siblings, which is an option because then you increase your effective sample sizes. But that comes at the cost of you not accounting for you account for a lower percentage of the co-serial genes.
Right, and also there's just a risk that diagnoses of autism in the father are correlated to divorce, or
Yeah.
that there's like famously fairly strong correlations between parental psychopathology and divorce, or families breaking up, or not forming at all necessarily. So that's a good point. So you guys really only focused on sort of like complete families or full siblings where both parents were at least shared at some point. Okay,
Yeah.
and so as you said, like you just named the countries, right? Norway, Sweden, and Finland. I think that's no. Are there Danes in the study as well?
No, we will not have access to Danish data or Danish colleagues, so
And when you
unfortunately,
say data, you just mean their register. So basically, everyone's medical records, insofar as they're recorded.
yeah.
So if if the children are born in any of these or in the individual countries, then they'd be the birth would be registered. And if there were any medical involvement, so an epidural, then that would be registered as well, basically.
Yes, in all of the countries they have medical birth registers where all the children who were born were included. And another point as to the parental psychiatric disorders and so on, especially if you're interested in autism or neurodevelopmental disorders that have an early onset. I mean, you have to consider the fact that you would have rather extreme left translation bias uh, there as well. Given the fact that uh, most of the so if you have somebody born in the 1970s and you're interested in autism or ADHD, it's not likely that be diagnosed at the adequate time point, right? They might get a diagnosis later on in life, but then comes the question of what does that mean? What does that? So as you know from molecular genetic studies of the age at onset for ADHD, there are these important etiological differences between those that are diagnosed earlier, which is more overlapping with other neurodevelopmental disorders, whilst those who are diagnosed later, their condition is more related to mood disorders such as depression,
Well,
bipolar disorder.
that's an interesting thing you bring up there. Yeah, so it's true that for definitely autism diagnosis and ADHD diagnosis, the prevalence has gone up dramatically. I don't know that necessarily there's been that much, or the change in actual sort of presentation of symptoms has been as dramatic, but these weren't recognized as disorders, right? So I give my personal example often, where my father is very dyslexic, so he had to just leave school at 14 because they just said like, well, you aren't able to learn, and in my case, they could just recognize the dyslexia and solve it. Once it started like seriously messing up my reading, and in my kid, they are able to like registered like in the first few months of like formal writing education. They were like, yep, she needs support, and it's even earlier than right. So these things are changing quickly, and usually happily also with better intervention. But yeah, you're right. So even if you were to know the parental diagnosis, they would be very different things, right? Because being diagnosed in the 70s was just a different thing than being diagnosed in now. So those are great points. And exactly, and you guys use siblings, so their parents are identical.
Yeah.
Right, and maybe for psychologists important to know, you only use the difference between the siblings. So it's not just that the sample are the siblings, you're basically doing the statistical equivalent of like sibling 1 minus sibling 2, right? Because it's like between families, so the different families, their differences are completely washed out, basically, out of the study. Okay. Yes. And so you did this in 4.5 million individuals. Those are the kids, basically, right? 4.5 million kids. But even then, autism is kind of rare. And as you said earlier, you really only use the individuals where one of them has autism. The sibling pairs were one of them. Because if one of them, and then actually also one of them has the epidural, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so even though you have all of Scandinavia, like a massive sort of, well, except for Denmark, I don't technically know whether that's Scandinavia, I'm sorry. I'm going to get angry responses, but they are, okay. And so basically you have that, you need those 3 countries because this is a rare outcome. It's fairly prevalent for the use of sort of like epidural is fairly prevalent, but it's not necessarily very prevalent that one sibling will have been born after epidural, but the other won't, right? That's probably a role here. But then you did all of that and you basically found there is no association.
Yeah, so in terms of autism, then I think that the effective sample size there was around 20 or so thousand. So going from 4.5 million down to 20,000. And we also looked at ADHD because it's more prevalent and it's related to autism, etc. And we got better power there, obviously, because more prevalent. So that effective sample size there was above 50,000 at least. So it's still it's important to consider because as you mentioned, there were a couple of studies that used the within mother design after the initial study, and had pretty substantial sample sizes for between family analyses, right? So they were, I think, the largest one was around 800,000. But consider they didn't report all of them. They didn't report the effective sample sizes within families, right? But we can just imagine, that they were quite small compared to ours. And that has a really big implication because even though they found no real association within families, their precision was lacking. So couldn't exclude the possibility that there was an increase that was small, right? So I think that the upper bound of the confidence intervals were up to like 20% or something like that.
Right. Right, so someone could have come in and argued, well, the initial study found 37% increase in risk of autism, but your study, the interim studies between theirs and yours, they weren't powerful enough to say with any certainty that it might have still been like 20 or 25% risk increase, right? So there was like wiggle room there for someone to come in and argue that. That's a good point. And also like to just like to emphasize, in your study across all of Scandinavia, you do find, if we ignore the families, that mothers or births where there is an epidural, the child, if we ignore the structure of the families, right, and all the confounding, that there is an increased rate of diagnosis in these children.
Yes.
It's just that if we control for anything that could have originated from the mother or the father, right, that's their genomes, that's their life choices, that's all of it, right, then it's just kind of gone.
Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting to, like, because I read the original study and I immediately my mind went to, well, you only would need like a very small difference in pain sensitivity between mothers with a heightened sort of like predisposition for autism or even autism, because they didn't even measure that in the mothers, you'd only need them to be very slightly more sensitive to pain, for example, to have like an increased risk of epidural choices, and that would have just explained the entire cascade of what they found, right?
Yes.
Because that would have like then associated with the risk in the children. So that's I think that this is sort of like a good way to describe how I perceive your work when I feel helpless in the face of like what I think is like observational research that is not controlled fully, but also two has like this sort of risk in the sense that the thing they're studying is consequential, right? Because there's so much science, and a lot of pure observational research is kind of good, but I kind of like my hairs raise when it's about something like a risky outcome in children, like being diagnosed with autism and something related to the health of the mother, and it will steer people's choices. And I'm like, oh, this could go wrong. But I just sit there steaming, being angry at Twitter, and you just like were able to go and help people out and sort of like solve it. But that brings me to other research you do, right? So
Sure.
a lot of your research is about finding at least one or two steps better ways to control. And sometimes it's family or using siblings, and in other cases it's using people's life courses, like the internal structure of people's life courses. And an interesting study of yours that's like, it's a bit older, but it's sort of one I really like, is sort of like, it brings back your criminology background as well, I guess. It's the triggers of violent criminality in patients with psychotic disorders, so that's schizophrenia diagnoses and bipolar disorder diagnoses, and other individuals. Now, it is just an observational fact that people with a diagnosed schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, they will be interacting with the police or law enforcement way more often across their lives, and they will be convicted or suspected of far more criminal behavior, especially violent criminal behavior, right? And I don't want to necessarily point fingers or place blame on any of that. That's just a fact due to their interactions with care and other spaces where they, or being homeless, they will just interact with the police more and be involved in violent criminality more often. And so you started that study, I guess, to find potential trigger points, right? So what are events in people's lives that cause these people to or people in general, but like specifically people with psychotic disorders, to be convicted of violent crimes. And so talk me through like what triggers did you select there? Why did you end up like selecting? Are these just like things criminologists know to be important, or?
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to study a wide range of different stressful life events that were properly measured in the national registers. Yeah, so it was a combination of injury-related types of triggers, so violent victimization, but also head injuries, um, suicidal behaviors, and yeah, accidents in different ways, but also substance intoxication and parental bereavement. So these were a couple of these stressful life events that were important, that we thought had a strong impact potentially, and that we wanted to test. And the fact is that a lot of these triggers, they don't occur once; they occur multiple times as well. So there is a huge variation, particularly in people with psychotic disorders, in these triggers trying throughout their lives. So what we decided was to look into their proximal effect. So for each of these triggers, we looked at the time when they occurred, and then we followed up the individuals for a week, and we checked whether they had been registered for having committed a violent act throughout this period. Then we went back 30 days in time, and we followed them up for 7 days. And then we did the same thing again and again and again, 3 years back in time. So all of these previous time points, they offered us a baseline risk of violence, and then we compared them to the period after the trigger had occurred. So, given that we are comparing individuals with themselves across time, we're accounting for all of the factors that are constant within the individual. So, everything from genetic factors, early childhood environmental factors, if they had early onset or developmental disorders, etc. So it's a way for us to try to isolate the effects of the triggers on the outcomes.
And maybe to make that come more alive for people that aren't too familiar with this kind of work. So two things I'd note, right, is that obviously the amount of intoxication someone undergoes in their lives, right, it varies a lot across individuals. And were you to sort of like ignore the fact that these differences exist between people, even if discounting even sort of genetics or whatever very distant causes you could that may very well be very important, right? You would if you were to simply correlate in only people with a psychotic disorder, the week after intoxication with other weeks across people, you would like ignore the fact that some people just have way more intoxication events than others. They just are far more addicted to substances or far more reckless in their drug use or abuse. And that's an important point as well, right? So these are very different people with a very different life course, and some of them are homeless, some of them are not, some of them are on severe medication, some of them are in inpatient clinics, others are not, and you're just trying to isolate all of that by only looking within the individual. And then one
Yes.
thing I'd noticed as a psychologist, which was kind of magical to me, is the psychologists would generally take this kind of data and fit a random effects model. They would say like, oh, there's variation within person and variation across time, right? But I'm giving every person their own little random effect. Now that doesn't quite do what you want to do, right? Because it will sort of like model kinds of important things. It's very common for psychologists to do it that way. But what it doesn't do is eliminate all between person variation. You guys are more like economists that way, right? You take fixed effects. You're basically taking everyone's time series
Yes.
of like events happening, and you just abstract their personal mean. You subtract that basically from the data effectively. It works slightly differently, obviously, to like I guess a fixed effect Poisson or logistic model, but that's an important nuance. Psychologists get their kind of roots random effects, but you guys, like economists and I guess like sociologists, you lose fixed effects.
Yeah, that is an important point. That we're only interested in within family effects. I mean, that's one of my pet peeves from some of the studies that I see, where they collect a lot of great data from large numbers of families, and then they have, oh, here are cases and there are healthy siblings, and then they compare means between these groups, and that's the same thing as looking within families and comparing each sibling to their co-sibling. If they do that, then they get a completely different estimate. And that's because the latter will account for familial factors better than the first one. Uh, so yeah. But the problem is that you will have much you will have there's, you won't have as much power when you're within families, because like I said, you're looking into the families where they are differentially exposed and have different outcomes. Well, so you will lose power, but you will gain more in terms of
Closer to what you want it to be.
exactly. Oh, to the truth, at least. I mean, to some, in some sense.
Yeah,
But
it's a variance bias trade-off. You're taking care of like some biases that arise from family, or in the studies where you use sort of individuals over time, you take care of bias that arises from between person differences, and you're getting rid of those biases, but you're losing some precision. And the interesting thing is like obviously the sibling design wouldn't work in this paper, right? Because like you want to know whether the exposures in people with a psychotic disorder are increasing your risk for violent convictions or violent events. But very rarely will two siblings both have a psychotic disorder. And even if they had, many psychiatrists will tell you that doesn't mean they'll have it to the same extent or to the same severity, right?
Yeah.
So here you had to do within person over time. Um, and one thing I found really interesting about your findings is that, like, in terms of triggers for violent criminality, there's very little differences between just regular individuals that don't have a diagnosis and people with psychotic disorder. Now, to be clear, people with a psychotic disorder will be convicted and or found to be suspected in very many more events, but the triggers don't differ necessarily that much, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are clear differences in the absolute risks, but in terms of relative risks, they're pretty similar for all of the examined triggers, with the exception of parental bereavement, where we saw that the individuals with schizophrenia primarily, but also bipolar disorder, although the confidence intervals was quite wide, had much higher risk. I think that the odds ratio was around 4, and for individuals without any psychotic disorders, I think it was under 2 or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I looked them up. There were like 4 and under 2, and the interesting thing, like as a psychologist, that what immediately struck me was like it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, the social structure around someone with schizophrenia will very often, far into adulthood, have to rely on their parents or siblings for all kinds of social support, right? They may live with their parents far into adulthood, which means that they may be evicted upon the death of their parents, right? So I could immediately see sort of this increased risk of interaction with law enforcement, increased risk of violence, because they're entire. Not only are they losing their parents, like we all, what bereavement is basically, it's very invasive for everyone, but for them, for people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, it may very often also involve needing to move out of the house, right? Because if they still live in their parental home, or if they like those are like far more invasive things, and then you could immediately imagine how that could like lead to violent behavior. And you could also see how the study then sort of points to a lack in sort of our social structure, where this is specifically an event for these individuals that have this diagnosis are just far more invasive, and it's obviously predictable, right? Because the moment it happens, someone dies. That's a thing. The state interacts with that. Like there is just a very natural point to then say like, okay, let's bring in this person's psychiatrist. And for me, that was a very interesting way of identifying a risk that's actionable, right? And that was just, I mean, I'm just like telling you how great your study is, but that's just that's just the thing that struck me at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. We couldn't test for it. I mean, that's one of the limitations of using nationwide registries. I mean, to the you could see this as being hypothesis generating, and you would need more detailed clinical but also social data to really delve into the mechanisms. We can't way much beyond this. Obviously, now that I think about it, you could look at whether people have siblings living close by, or the nature of their living arrangements, and so on and so forth to look into it. But I think that it also needs some qualitative uh, research in this area as well. But yeah, I think we argued in line with what you were saying, that these findings may be explained by the social support and so on, which seems the most plausible explanation at this point, I guess.
And it's interesting because that's what I like about register studies is somehow register studies have this way of generating hypotheses that then sort of almost, because they go from like the coarsest of like global nationwide data, but then
Yeah.
the hypothesis that comes to mind, that I agree it's not a given fact, it's just a hypothesis. You just have an effect size estimate, and then our minds collectively go to mechanisms, but they almost always just immediately delve very deeply into like, oh, that would require qualitative data, or to require someone with knowledge of the exact problem to go in and go like, okay, well, let's select people that live at home when it happens, or use a group of people that are estranged from their parents as controls, because you wouldn't see it in those people if it was really, related to their physical living arrangements. And yeah, but those follow-ups exist, and it's interesting. I think it's a gap in our current. Maybe I'm reasoning too much for my own position, but it's sort of like where there's still a distance between the kind of people that do the qualitative research that would be required to follow up, and the people that do the population-wide sort of like. Are there many instances of you working with the people that do the follow-up, that go into one of your findings and dig deeper? Is that something you do often?
No, I mean, actually, been thinking about that quite a bit. It reminded me of um, one of my former PIs, a sociologist called Stanley. He wrote a really interesting PhD dissertation in the early 1990s about evictions. I think the English translation would be evicted into welfare state. And he had this mixed methods approach, where he had access to with quantitative data on addictions, but also social records from the municipalities where he looked into it. And it was quite interesting because he fitted a model, he developed this model, and he predicted the risk of being evicted for his sample. And then he looked into those who had really high probabilities of being evicted, but who weren't evicted, and vice versa. And then he looked into the social records to try to understand why that was the case. And I've been thinking about that because we have the sort of here in the UK we have electronic health record data that we're looking into and trying to understand and trying to use some machine learning algorithms to get the free text stuff out. But I've been thinking about adapting a similar sort of approach there for some of our projects where we have a prediction model and look at the predicted probabilities and then try to look into certain cases and see, hey, what can we learn more about these individuals? I think that's going to be key. And I think that there's something that genomics people could also benefit from using now that there's also um, they're linking it to a lot of these electronic health record data as well.
Right. That's an interesting. Um, it's an interesting advancement, right? It's sort of like, to stick fairly close to your example, just for the purpose of illustration, right? So once you've identified a risk factor that's specific to people with like a psychotic disorder, you have a group of people that to which then the outcome, they do end up in contact with the police or law enforcement. They do end up in violent situations or needs a bit additional care, and some don't. And for a very long time, that was the end of the road. Or you'd had to be a very sort of like motivated qualitative sociologist and go read 1,700 case reports. That usually you couldn't really take out of a courthouse, right? Because there were like, some court
Yeah.
records are accessible, but not necessarily openly accessible, or just online or something, and you'd have to like dig through paper. And obviously, well, language models are usually now used for people that cheat on their exams, right? Or like they don't really have a useful. But the notion of a model that can like read many texts, and
Yeah.
it doesn't even have to be perfect, because I like even a very motivated group of sociologists, they can get to a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand cases, and that's just it. But
Yeah.
these techniques could at least help you sort of like dig into qualitative research in a way that may not be as good as very good qualitative researchers reading all the records, but it will certainly help you follow up on hypothesis. And that's an interesting idea. I do wonder though, because you told me now you were working with English medical records. Do they have the same family data structure? Do they have sibling information or parent offspring information, or is it not the same as the Scandinavian?
No, we still are thinking about do not want to, but things are moving in the UK. There are a lot of interested actors who want to establish better registers similar to the North. I mean, we have a new resource, relatively new resource called SAIL, which has similar data to the Nordic countries, but in Wales. So we have a couple of our default students doing some work there, and they're going to be open to proper census data and hopefully also crime data. So it's going to be interesting. But I think that we're moving towards that because they're seeing all the benefits that that had in the Nordic countries, but also elsewhere now. Uh, so hopefully, uh, but the electronic health records, to the best of my knowledge, they're not linked to census data in that sense. So that would be possible to link it to servants. We're using it for other purposes, though. I mean, most of what we're going to talk about today is my interest in etiological question. But the other part of my work is also predictive modeling. So we're using it for those purposes, and we don't really well. We could benefit from using time with this, but we don't. It's not a mandatory sort of.
No, no, but it's an interesting sort of thing to note for people watching is that like all the problems you have in just plain epidemiology of mental health, right, with terms of confounding, once these sort of like once data mining of qualitative resources becomes easier, you will still have all those confound. Like there's no machine learning isn't it has no bearing on necessarily on confounding, right? And so your and my uses might be different than other people's, but like people that want to like extract outcomes or exposures from qualitative data using machine learning, that's fine, but it will be as confounded as sort of the register data. So that's the thing to note. I think what sort of like one thing you said just that's really interesting and sort of comes to the forefront in one of your papers is the intersection between criminal justice, mental health, and social exposures. And you have this paper on kids being placed in out of home care. I think that was in Finland, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, and so like I from the Dutch situation, I know there's been basically an uproar the last 5 to 10 years about you know situations in out of home care being far worse than people imagined. The consequences of out of home care just not always being positive. Now, it's obviously a very heavy decision anywhere, right? So these aren't situations where it's legitimately a choice always to leave kids in the situation they're in. But more recently, people have been focusing on the fact that like the situation kids end up in, leaving their home, isn't always ideal either. And so one of your studies goes into sort of like children and adolescents being placed in out of home care in Finland. Now, if I'm correct, that's a sibling discordance study as well, right?
Yes. Exactly. I mean, we looked into the entire population, so we are presenting between family estimates as well. Um, you could say that the study is divided into two parts. The first part is looking into um, the associations between being placed in out-of-home care up until the age of 15 on subsequent um, long-term outcomes. So anything problem with psychiatric disorders, different types of injuries, substance misuse, violent crime, premature mortality, and so on, and socioeconomic status indicators later on in life. And in the first part, I mean, the main reason for why I wanted to do that was that we had a couple of these Swedish studies that used smaller samples that did not find any real differences between those who were placed compared to the siblings who were not. And then they concluded that basically doesn't improve things, but but in this case, we show that, well, if you have power, it would show that it would deteriorate things. But then the question is, what does that really mean? Because, so if you have a family where you have differentially exposed kids to out-of-home care placement, why are some placed and others are not? And and the thing with that then is, we did a rather extensive sensitivity analyses. We looked into pre-placement diagnoses and injuries and so on. And as expected, we found that those who were placed within the same families that were differentially exposed, those who were placed had higher rates of behavioral problems and so on, which is expected. And in the case when in the case for all of them were placed, it was usually the parents who had both socioeconomically being disadvantaged, but also having psychiatric disorders and other types of behavioral problems. Well, so that was important just to illustrate the fact that hey, people with power, then you will find these differences. But then the question is, what do you make of it? And that's a harder question to answer. But the main sort of analysis in that paper, for me at least, was the second part, where we looked at a group of children from families where all of the children had been placed in care. And that allowed us to look at specific factors or placement factors, and how those impacted or were associated with the outcomes of interest. And there we found, for instance, that institutional care, even when accounting for pre-placements, behavioral problems and injuries and everything else, and even like prenatal factors and so on. With all of those adjusted for, we still found that it increased the risk of a wide range of outcomes. Also, the number of placement episodes. So it is, yes, moving around in the system multiple times. That was also. But then, interestingly, we didn't find much of an effect for the duration of care, and also not a lot for the first age at placement, which is usually an indicator of behavioral problems. Because if you're late fall, then usually it's because the parents don't want to deal with your behavioral problems.
Yeah, and that's so basically the interesting underlying issue here is you can control for parental factors because you have these siblings, but you can't control for child factors. And there is this sort of suspected maybe interaction that like a parent or a family with problems, socioeconomic or related to addiction or related to the mental health of the parent, uh, among the kids, the ones with the highest degree of problems themselves, they will be the child most likely to clash with the parent, more likely to sort of like not be able to be supported by the parent themselves, also most likely to be noticed by society, right? Because once a child starts having problems, then teachers and other caretakers they notice. So like they're just selectively ending up in placement. So your design, even though it controls for the parents, it doesn't control for any feature of the child or any aspect of the child that may relate. And then you did this smart thing, right? You have families, very many families, where both or multiple children are placed. And then you're just looking at, again, differences between siblings, or maybe also half siblings in this case,
No,
full siblings, where they differ in terms of like where they're placed. Like, are they placed in a residential home? Are they placed in sort of more of a institutional environment? Are they moved around a lot? So that's like the placements, I suppose, they're generally means that they're moved from one placement to the other, not necessarily back to the parents, but that could maybe also be the case. And then and then you just find that some of those factors that suggest that the more institutional, government organized sort of like care is, those kids are worse off.
Yes.
Okay. And those kids that move around a lot, they're also worse off. Now, that doesn't eliminate the potential situation where those places are unable to cater to or help children with strong behavioral problems, right? Because I imagine if two siblings are or multiple siblings are placed out, then someone makes a determination who goes where, and ideally, I'm sure they try to keep kids together. But somehow in your data, some kids end up in institutional care, whereas others end up in more home-like environments. Then that obviously, again, is a selection problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
We,
But it does
we
suggest that those centers, even though there maybe is the belief in the system that they are better equipped to deal with those selected children, that doesn't seem to be the case, right? Because they're not better off.
No, I mean, one of the issues, I mean, so first off, in terms of the selection, we tried our best with the available data to account for the difference, and we couldn't find much. Um, the- Second, I think that um, one of the problems that we have is that these effects are averages, right? So on average, it will go much more poorly for them versus but there's a huge variability there as well. So for some, it will go much better. For others, it won't go. The problem we had there was that we didn't even have basic sort of data. So where have they been placed? So, and do we have any characteristics of those places that we could use to inform our understanding of the variation? And that's the key thing, but that is not being recorded at the moment. Without that, it's very hard to do much. Secondly, we tried to for a separate project, we tried to estimate within individual effects as well, because given that people are moving around and then they're home and then they're in different types of care, etc., you could look at certain outcomes, um, let's say self-harm or something, during periods when they're in different types of care situations, and compare the risks with themselves across time. What problem with those analyses was that we just didn't have sufficient power, so it wasn't really. But one thing that we could be, well, someone, anyone interested, could do is to gather the data that is available in Finland, Sweden, Norway, and I believe in Denmark now. They have these types of childcare registers for the episodes and so on. They could just pull the estimates across all the different countries and see we'll find something. Well, that would be quite interesting to see, and that would give us more confidence in the fact that institutional care is as detrimental as we think that it is based on our findings.
Yeah, but currently, so basically, you're arguing here in this specific case for better data on foster
Yes.
care because there are suggestions it's just not necessarily benefiting kids. And that is definitely something where more data sort of, and again, you have this finding, it's an estimate, and now you need to dig deeper, go into qualitative data that gets you more context on what are these places that kids are placed in, right? Because right now I'm sure they're just a variable in your register, but that doesn't tell you much about like what's the institution like, how many kids are placed there, what's the quality of the education of the people that work there, what's the supervision over those people, like all that stuff is sort of like where we need more data to sort of go deeper, I guess.
Yeah, training of staff is a big thing, and the quality of the care being provided throughout and different levels of it. Yeah, definitely.
Interesting. Okay, well, that's again all these sort of like sort of threads to follow up and dig deeper into the data, right? And as you said, that this is again a project where you could hugely benefit because the number of individuals affected in these situations is not, luckily, is not that high, and this means that you like even all the data on a Scandinavian country isn't sufficient to sort of get at like the nuances. And then a final paper I'd like to discuss, and it's a preprint, it's not out yet, you guys,
I think that's perfect and review.
is similar, like risk of an exposure on a set of outcomes, I guess. And it's sort of like being the victim of a violent crime is the specific exposure here, right? And obviously, psychiatric literature, trauma is a huge sort of variable, but it's often, and you noted in the introduction, it's often grouped or amorphously measured with a questionnaire that just asked for like 12 times the trauma, make a little sum of them, go like, you have trauma, the other people don't, so but like this is, you are very specifically, I guess that's maybe a criminologist background, interested in the consequences of being a victim of a violent crime, and then the outcomes are psychopathologies, basically, mostly, right?
Yes, mostly we call them common psychiatric disorders. So it's depression, anxiety, personality disorder, alcohol and drug use disorder, and also suicidal behavior and premature mortality. So, of course. So those are the outcomes that we're looking into. So in terms of the trigger paper that you just mentioned, I mean, one of the strongest triggers was for violence, was violent victimization, uh, interestingly, and um, we have also another paper with similar results for violent victimization as a trigger for suicidal behavior. Uh, and but those are just personal risk factors that we've really assessed. So we're now interested in looking into the long-term effects of being exposed to violent victimization, and yeah, so we had we looked into the registers in Sweden and Finland. I think we identified over 127,000 individuals who were victimized at some point throughout their lives. And we moved into those who were born in 1973 in Sweden because that's when the patient register started. A lot of people are injured very young, so the I think the median age was around 21 for the first victimization event, and then we follow them up for an average of 10 years after the victimization event, and we're also we compared them to unrelated controls, but also to their siblings. And we found that compared to their siblings who had not been violently victimized, those who had been were 2 to 3 times more likely to develop any of the examined outcomes, including premature mortality.
And
So,
so for the people listening along that aren't too familiar with the sibling designs themselves, the effect compared to the population controls is way higher.
yes.
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? You get like an odds ratio of like 7, and then but then you compare to siblings, it's still very high, like elevated 2 or 3 times, but it's not 7,
No.
right? So what you're doing here is you're sort of saying that even if we take all these sort of unmeasurable things that siblings share, like I don't know, their primary school, their high school, their genes, all the things you can measure in these kind of registers, you take that into account, there's still this elevated risk.
Yes, so siblings, well over full siblings, they share approximately half of their co-segregating genes and childhood early environments. And so that's what the estimate is really accounting for. But that doesn't mean that necessarily that it means that it is causal because you still have residual genetic confounding. We attempted to look into or to use the Swedish twins, the monozygotic twins, who share essentially all of the cross-segregating genes, let's say. And we just didn't have sufficient power to do anything meaningful because, as you can imagine, rare exposure and rare outcome is lovely, and in a small group of individuals, it's not a good combination. So, so you still have to take this. You have to be careful with over-interpreting the associations. But I agree. I mean, the associations, even within families, is quite strong and does suggest that there is something there, but we can't draw any firm conclusions about causality. But to the best of our abilities, with the different types of sensitivity analyses that we've done, everything points toward um, an important sort of, as I mean, an important risk factor.
And that's
And
sort of like I like that it brings us back to the beginning when I said like your kind of work isn't necessarily making like the term causal inference is just very popular in social sciences right now, and that's a good thing. We should all think about causality, and we should think about whether we can estimate a causal effect. But sometimes I feel that sort of like if the answer is no, we can't really, right? Then the economist or the sociologist, the epidemiologist will say then, well, let's not do anything. But as a psychologist or psychiatric researcher, I'm like, well, for us the answer is almost always no, we can't really. And you've made this brand of like doing, at the very least, doing observational research with a far better set of like techniques to control for immeasurable confounding. And that's sort of like, I think that's the middle ground where we should be aiming for. And that's sort of like, yeah, maybe that's a good way to going to wrap it up. Before we completely wrap it up, I asked you to think of two papers that aren't yours, that you think the people watching or listening along should sort of dig into. Do you want to discuss those briefly?
Sure. So the first one is was written by Ralph Kuyahalkola, who is psychiatric. Oh no, he's a biostatistician working with twin register. He's doing a lot of work with psychiatric epidemiology. So blurred lines there. He in back in 2014 in behaviour genetics, who wrote this paper called "Maternal Smoking During Pregnancy and Adverse Outcomes in Offspring: Genetic and Environmental Sources of Covariance," and that's really interesting because that takes the another step after the sibling comparisons. Because in the sibling comparison, you're basically assessing whether there is a residual effect after you've accounted for familial factors, including genetics and environment. But the method that he's using here, called the children of twins or children of siblings design, it it estimates the sources of the confounding to how much is genetics and how much is environment. And briefly, what he found was that maternal smoking during pregnancy seems to be causally related to uh, birth-related adverse outcomes, but not behavioral or cognitive outcomes later on. And had some nice estimates for it. So those who are interested in sibling comparison designs and the next step after, I recommend that paper. The second paper is quite different. It's partly co-authored by your previous guest, Aiko Feet, with I think the first author is Ashley Watts from last year in Nature Reviews Psychology. The paper is a critical evaluation of the key factor in literature. I think that's quite interesting, and I learned a lot from it actually, where we have this general factor for psychopathology, so that the all more highly correlated, um, and that there might be something that causes these correlations between them called P factor. And it's not as straightforward, and I thought it was particularly the differences between studies and standardized factor loadings and so on. Thought it was really interesting and made me think a bit about it. So if you're interested in measurement problems and so on, I would recommend that.
I might do an episode on the p factor at some point. I think it's sort of a okay off the cuff. I think the p factor is a ridiculous concept. I fully expect there be many shared causes between sort of psychopathologies, but to group them as sort of a shared cause is sort of like I think that's they're shared causes, but like we can find out what they are. We don't have to like make a latent variable. We can just go and find causes of the shared occurrence of psychopathology. But maybe I'm starting the next episodes now, and so let's not do that. Let's just
Right.
Amir, I want to thank you for this lovely conversation. I like talking to you, so this
So
is just also me indulging myself. And thanks for discussing your papers. And there will be links to all the papers in the show notes or in the notes below. And maybe chat some other time in the future. Thank you.
thanks for having me.